U.S. President Barack Obama has made it clear that his administration will pivot to Asia during his second term in office. But what form will that take, and what role might Korea play? To answer those questions and more, we pivot to Scott Snyder from the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Snyder, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here, Scott.
Now, we're going to be hearing a lot more about this pivot to Asia in the coming months and years. What are we going to see as the U.S. moves forward?
Well, what the Obama administration has put forward in its first term is essentially a pledge to make investments in Asia as a region proportionate to its significance and in response to the fact that this is where the most dynamically growing economies are. We've had good returns on investment in Asia in the past. The U.S. has been over-focused on the Middle East and Afghanistan, and so this, I think, is really designed as a strategic initiative to recognize that Asia is playing a more important role in the world and is more important to the United States than maybe has been recognized in the past.
China clearly doesn't see it that way, though. How is China approaching this whole scenario, this whole situation?
Well, there are voices in China that see the U.S. as trying to contain China. That's not the way the administration is describing it, and in my experience, it's not necessarily the way that the most informed Chinese analysts are perceiving it either. It's important to recognize that while the Obama administration is spending time trying to strengthen alliances, it's also spending a lot of time engaging directly with the Chinese. This administration has its highest level and most intensive bilateral dialogue on global issues every year with China. And so while the United States is trying to strengthen its alliance frameworks in Asia, investing in Asian institutions, it's also engaging in direct dialogue with China on many issues around the world.
And what does success look like for the U.S., and what, conversely, would failure look like for the U.S. in the long game here?
Well, the thing I worry about with regard to what the administration likes to call rebalancing, but which is widely known as the pivot, is really the question of whether it's going to be sustainable. The administration has indicated that it wants to make these investments. As you know, currently in Washington, there's a focus on fiscal challenges, the quote-unquote fiscal cliff, and the idea of sequestration, which would be a 10% across-the-board cut in defense. That would put, I think, if it goes forward, a big stumbling block in the way of any attempt to try to invest further in defense in Asia. A second area that I think is a challenge is related to the ability of the U.S. to lead on trade. And we've got this Trans-Pacific partnership that the U.S. government has put forward, but it's not clear how fast or how far that is going to move.
And there are a lot of people as well that see this dynamic playing out, and they see some sort of confrontation becoming inevitable between the U.S. and China. Things have been rather quiet so far, but do you see these tensions boiling up in the future? And if so, in what way might they do so?
Yeah. Well, I think in the region, including in Korea, there are two ways that, two mistakes or misperceptions that are often made as Asians look at what the U.S. is doing in response to China's rise. The first is to focus on cooperation and to imagine a G2 where the U.S. and China are trying to rule the world. And I don't think that's going to happen. At the same time, there's also this perception that U.S. rebalancing is a containment policy toward China. But the fact of the matter is that the U.S. and China, both leaderships recognize that that would entail incredible costs, politically and otherwise, to both countries. And so that means we're kind of stuck in this situation where the United States and China are cooperating and competing with each other at the same time. And so that's the key, I think, to understand the rebalance or the pivot, is that it's really a strategy that recognizes Asia's rise, not just China's rise, and responds accordingly.
And it's in neither nation's best interest to get into some sort of military confrontation or something of that sort, is basically what you're saying. They've got to work together and find a common ground, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, as China rises, that circumstance does have a regional influence. It's having an effect on neighbors. And it also introduces some uncertainty because it's not necessarily clear exactly where China is going in the long term. And so, really, I think rebalancing is about engaging with China as a way of trying to encourage China to act in a cooperative fashion, but it's also about hedging against the possibility that China might turn in a more negative direction. And to provide reassurance, especially in the region, against that possibility.
And it would seem that Korea is in a particularly difficult situation, trying to balance its interests with the U.S. and China as well. What role will Korea play as this new sort of U.S.-China dynamic develops?
Yeah. Well, it's true that Korea often feels that it's stuck in the middle of the larger powers. And I think that the critical thing to understand is that Korea sees it as in its own interest not to have to make a choice between the United States and China. Yet at the same time, Korea is in this very interesting and complicated circumstance, actually very similar to the circumstance that all the other countries in the region face, where they are increasingly dependent on China for economic growth, but in the case of Korea, they also depend on the United States as part of the security alliance. So how does Korea kind of navigate between dependence on China economically and dependence on the United States for security? What does that mean for the relative weight that Korea places on China and the U.S. respectively? That's the choice and challenge that I think Koreans are really grappling with, being placed in between the two countries.
And you've mentioned before that you would advise Korea to set up a senior level consultative group with China. What would that entail? What would that group do exactly? And why do you think that would help?
Yeah, well, I've made that recommendation specifically related to some of the challenges that the region faces related to uncertainty about North Korea's future. And so I think that the focus of a U.S.-China ROK discussion is most relevant related to how do we deal with or hedge against the prospect of instability in North Korea. It's a challenging dialogue to try to set up because, of course, China has its own relationship with North Korea. It doesn't want to send any signal to North Korea that it thinks that North Korea is unstable. In fact, China wants to reinforce North Korea's stability.
Right.
But at the same time, there is a sense in which it's in the interest of all three of these countries to work cooperatively to try to encourage North Korea's integration into the region and to try to prevent the possibility that instability in the North could spill over and affect China or South Korea or have a negative impact in the region.
And is that something that you feel may happen in the coming months or possibly years to get those talks going?
Well, I personally think that we may still be some time away from a formal, official U.S.-China South Korea dialogue on these kinds of issues. But if you think about it, the six-party framework through which all these countries in the region have been trying to deal with the North Korean nuclear issue brings the same countries together and creates an environment in which the region is focused on the same, problem. In this case, it's defined as the North Korean nuclear issue. But that's in a way, a start toward thinking about cooperative ways of addressing the major source of insecurity in the region.
President Obama's second term, can we expect anything different than what we've seen about North Korea policy from the Obama administration?
Yeah. Well, I think the key to understanding what the Obama administration might do in the second term is to understand that the first priority that the Obama administration has emphasized in its policy toward North Korea is the importance of coordination with allies. And so that means that whatever approach South Korea takes toward North Korea would be a subject of close consultation and coordination, and it may even result in some potential shift in approach in a coordinated way by the U.S. and South Korea toward the North.
And there have been calls for South Korea to take more of a lead in the six-party talks and in those sorts of areas. That remains to be seen if they will, of course. The presidential candidates, many of them are advocating a return to the six-party talks. Is that something that you see actually happening in the next administration for the Korean president?
Yeah. Well, I don't know yet if the six-party talks are going to be realized, because I think the critical factor that is necessary for those talks to begin again is that North Korea has to commit to discussing denuclearization. But what I think that we can see on the horizon very clearly is that regardless of who wins the South Korean presidential election, there's a desire on the part of South Korea to engage directly with the North Korean leadership in order to stabilize the situation on the Korean Peninsula.
And President Obama, during his trip to Myanmar, basically called on North Korea to follow Myanmar's lead on reforms. What did you make of those remarks?
Yeah. I think it's very interesting and notable that President Obama addressed the North Korean leadership directly in his comments in the University of Rangoon. He's done that one time before this year, and that was in his speech here in Seoul at the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. It shows that the Obama administration has been thinking about how Myanmar's example could apply to North Korea. I think it was a way of signaling to North Korea actually the same message that President Obama delivered to the world in his first inauguration speech, that he would extend an outstretched hand to those who will unclench their fists. Of course, in 2009, what we saw was that the North Koreans followed that invitation to dialogue with provocations. But now they've got a second chance, I think. In a way, I think that what President Obama was doing was offering a second chance.
And we're looking a bit to the future. Let's look to the past 5 years specifically. How would you personally assess the Lee Myung-bak administration's stance toward North Korea over these past 5 years?
Well, it's I think unfortunate that the relationship between North Korea and South Korea has deteriorated in the way that it has. I know that there's a lot of criticism of the MB policy, but I think that it's also the case that North Korea bears a significant share of the responsibility for the depth of the decline in the inter-Korean relationship. Now we're going to see, it looks like all the candidates want to have a kind of new start at this, but it also means that it's not going to be long before they run into some of the same challenges. And so the issue of how do you hold North Korea accountable when they engage in bad behavior, I think is a perennial issue that every South Korean administration has grappled with. Also, just because you try to give assistance to North Korea doesn't necessarily mean that the North is going to respond, in kind. But the main, I think, frustration that exists here is that as a result of this rise in tensions in inter-Korean relations, there has not been a stable channel for managing the relationship. And I think that historically, really since Park Chung-hee, one of the things that South Koreans have expected most from their leaders has been to maintain contact with the North. It doesn't always mean that North and South will agree on everything, but the minimum requirement for managing the situation is to have some solid channel for contact.
So how would you advise then the incoming president of South Korea, how would you advise them to approach the North Korea issue coming from that new start? What would you say to them?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that it's important for the new South Korean president to be willing to have dialogue with North Korea. But I think that my first counsel would be expect that this is going to take time. Because historically what the North Koreans have done with new South Korean administrations is to test them, to find out what the parameters are, what are the ground rules, what can they get away with. And so, it's only after that phase passes that it ends up being possible to establish a more fruitful interaction between North and South Korea. I think that we saw that with actually DJ, we saw that with Roh Moo-hyun. Actually 2008 people forget, but there were a number of interactions in 2008 and 2009 between the North Koreans and the Lee Myung-bak administration, where one can imagine that things might have taken a slightly different turn. Right. And so, those are all, I think, relevant as guidance.
And we've been speaking a bit about the presidential candidates in the South Korean race. How would you assess them as it pertains to U.S. relations moving forward? Which of these candidates, I guess when you look at them and assess them, how are they going to sort of approach the U.S. when they come into office? And how is the U.S. In turn looking at these candidates as well?
Yeah. Well, I think that what we've seen historically as South Korea has become a mature democracy is that there's a confidence born of alliance cooperation between democratic systems. And so that means that institutionally there are ties that will, I think, sustain the relationship even if there might be coordination challenges that have to be managed. As you look at the three candidates, I don't think that the U.S. government is going to say that it has a favorite. I don't think there's necessarily a reason for the U.S. to be dissatisfied with any of the candidates. Because, the main factor in strength of leadership is support from the people. And so, a strong leader who has good support domestically in Korea will be a more effective partner with the U.S. Having said that, I think that the current Obama administration approach to North Korea meshes best with what I would call a conditions-based approach on denuclearization, rather than a transformative approach to North Korea. And so I think that there will be a bigger challenge and more difficulty in terms of trying to coordinate positions for a South Korean administration that decides to take a transformative approach to North Korea.
And speaking as well a bit about that, two of the candidates have said they will renegotiate or will seek a renegotiation of the Korea-U.S. free trade agreement should they come into power. What kind of resistance is the U.S. going to give if they try and do that?
Yeah. Well, my understanding is that it's possibly specific clauses that they might ask to look at in terms of revision. If that request comes up, then obviously, just as was the case in the run-up to ratification, those are issues that the U.S. is going to have to grapple with. So, for instance, the beef issue almost blew up the KORUS FTA. There were congressional concerns on auto provisions of the Bush FTA that ended up being renegotiated before it was presented for ratification under President Obama. This would be, another, I think, challenge that the economic negotiators would have to manage. But I think that in the overall context of the economic relationship, there should be, I think, a sustainable basis for managing that kind of issue.
Now, South Korea has seen its diplomatic position grow on the international stage, hosting the 2012 Seoul Nuclear Security Summit, winning a seat on the UN Human Rights Council. However, you have said previously that continuous growth is pretty much going to be impossible. Why did you say that?
Well, I think this is really coming from a report that we just released on assessing quote-unquote global Korea, what South Korea is doing in international security. And in fact, the overall, I think, emphasis of the report is that South Korea has begun to step out and take these roles, and that it's likely, I think, that it's going to continue. But I did address several obstacles to South Korea being able to play that role. And if you look longer term, there are demographic issues, there are financial issues, there are issues of political support domestically, all of which could limit what South Korea is willing to do on the international security front. But I think the main message here is really that at a time of fiscal austerity globally, Korea is emerging as a country that is willing to take a greater share of responsibility for security on the international stage.
All right. Well, Scott Snyder from the Council on Foreign Relations, we do thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Okay, thank you.
And that does it for us today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week after 10.